strokes create, quote, maximum behavioral disruption, unquote. And they are characterized as, quote, chemical lobotomies, and can produce an acute psychotic reaction in an individual not previously psychotic. That means that you go into a center just feeling a little bad because you're poor or no one's listening to you, and you come out wanting to kill someone. Not afraid of getting into fights, hurting people. You weren't that way when you went in. You were just poor going in. Now you're poor and violent and black. And that just makes it so much easier for Democrats and Republicans dancing down the street together, hand in hand, throwing money at the problem, and no one looking deeper. African Americans were found to suffer iatrogenic disorders, tardive dyskinesia, in higher proportions than white. These are irreversible neurological disorders caused by major tranquilizers. Yet the major tranquilizers are what the kids keep getting. In short, the drug-induced reactions are, quote, of such nature that an observer could be forgiven for assuming the person so affected was mentally ill, perhaps even dangerous. A person suffering from such a reaction, even to a minor degree, would experience great difficulty in being accepted by the man in the street as normal. The mental health professionals who are prepared to accept such grotesque reactions to their treatment, but inevitable risk attached to the cure of mental illness, have lost sight of the patient as the individual, unquote. And that's from a leading psychopharmacologist and author. So what's happening is that the kid, after they're on the drug, becomes so emotionally unstable, they just don't fit in anywhere anymore. And yet when they disrupt things, when they go out on the street, when they cause problems, no one is saying, were you on a psychiatric medication? They're just saying, well, they're a psychiatric case and they're black. Black in a psychiatric case is a bad label. Let's go a little further into this whole phenomenon of schizophrenia, which I consider personally one of the major frauds in the world of mental health. People do suffer problems in life. We all do. We all go through crisis and loss and fears. Everyone I know on a regular basis faces decisions that challenge them. None of us like to be fired. None of us like to be rejected. None of us like to feel that, where am I going to get the money to pay my rent, and what am I going to do to help my children, and think of all just the normal everyday occurrences that make us feel better than what we should. Life is this way. But in many people, they're so desperate for a solution that they seek out help with a psychiatrist, and then they're diagnosed as mentally ill. If one takes a look at psychiatry's textbook on mental illness, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, number 4, you can find that any normal behavior can be diagnosed as mental illness, and any adverse reaction to environmental influence, peer pressure, or social unrest has earned a psychiatric label. If you don't wake up on time, if you sleep poorly, if you drink coffee or smoke cigarettes, or if you give them up, if you stutter, if a child fidgets or loses things or can't wait till their turn in a game, if you've ever been intoxicated, if you have trouble with math, grammar, punctuation, if you have trouble writing expressively, today, all of these are mental illnesses in the Psychiatric and Diagnostic Manual. So if you just said to your doctor, "Doctor, I'm having trouble really expressing myself," you're insane. "Doctor, I'm stuttering," you're insane. I find that I'm not good at math. Of course you're insane. That's what they can say. Even teenagers who argue with their parents are, according to the DMS-4, suffering a mental illness called oppositional defiance disorder. Now today, if you argue with your parent, no matter what the reason is, even if it's a mild argument, even if you just disagree, you have oppositional defiance disorder. You need a tranquilizer. How far have we come from drapetomania? How far have we come from negritude? How far have we come from thinking blacks are black because of leprosy, when we're able to say to a person, if you're shy, you have mental illness. If you argue, you have mental illness. If you're not good at math, you have mental illness. And yet, when was the last time your physician, your politician, your church leader, your rabbi, your priest, or the Pope, or anyone else stopped, for 1/2 second in their self-righteous nature and said, my God, let's take a look at what they have done to classify all normal behavior as a disease of the mind. Every human being on the planet today, without any exception, can today, as easy as blinking an eye, be diagnosed with mental illness. Now look what they've done to people who were diagnosed for political reasons in Russia for over 60 years. Sakharov, Solov, think of all the great minds that were imprisoned and tortured, lobotomized, and given electroconvulsive therapy, all against their will because they were, quote, psychiatric cases. And what did we do? Nothing. Much of the current basis of psychiatric diagnosis is rhetoric about genes and IQ, creating educationally and mentally defective people. The IQ is a scam. It has no scientific basis whatsoever. It is a fraudulent test. And it shows how easy it is today to diagnose anyone as schizophrenic. In the first edition of the DMS in 1952, only 2 pages were devoted to 9 different types of stages of schizophrenia. By 1968, the number of pages was 3, but the different types increased to 16. In 1980, the Insurance Guide to Schizophrenia was released, DMS-3. Deregulation of the private psychiatric hospital industry began. With it, insurance companies required a formalized guide to what illnesses could be claimed against. The 3rd edition dedicated 6 pages, while it revised itself later, 2 years later, and then went up to 11 pages in schizophrenia. Now, at this point, the genetic link to so-called schizophrenia was introduced with psychiatrists involved in the Germany eugenics movement, and they were cited as the experts. They actually went back to the 1930s to give credence to why it was genetic. And one of the psychiatrists cited, Carl Schneider, was a key player in the men behind Hitler and was instrumental in planning and exterminating mental patients under the Nazi Operation T4. Schneider committed suicide before he could be tried in Nuremberg war trials. This didn't stop the American Psychiatric Association from quoting his work in its prestigious diagnostic manual. Terms like, quote, familial pattern, unquote, were introduced, and we saw that biological relatives were at risk of catching this, quote, disorder. As schizophrenia became the cash cow for psychiatrists, the DMS-4 was released last year with 24 pages devoted to schizophrenia. It's a myth. It does not exist. It's a fraud, but so is psychiatry. And it's non-science. Just fools. Studies show that psychiatrists diagnose African-American males as having schizophrenia 15 times the rate as they do whites. Why? Because they can. And no Democrat challenges them. Nope. You would think that people are supposed to be there with some more progressive thoughts on protecting them. No, they're the ones who protect the psychiatrists and fund every single initiative they have, all supposed to be to help the poor. Someday you'll realize how lacking in scholarship and true interest these people are. One study carried out in both 1984 and 1990 in Tennessee found that although African Americans represented only 16% of the entire Tennessee population, 48% of the almost 3,000 voluntary committed patients were African American. What were they diagnosed with? 37% of all the 21,000 African American patients, schizophrenia. But can you prove schizophrenia? No, you cannot. Is there a test for it? No, there is not. It's all subjective, but it's one of those things that when the lie is told enough times, nobody questions it. They all just get behind it and believe it because everyone's benefiting from it. Overcommitted? David Ram wrote an interesting article. Let me quote here. Quote, blacks are nearly 3 times more likely than whites to be locked up against their will in southern mental hospitals. Unquote. Well, that shouldn't surprise anybody. Quote, if you want to control people, what better way than to use the disability system? The system meets the needs of racial segregation by sending people away to secluded places in the country. We have a history of putting people we don't like away from us. Unquote.